Hello, welcome to my very first video on History Pop. This channel I will hope to review some movies with you, some history movies, and maybe you can take something out of it, learn something about all different kinds of history. So the first history I will be covering is the American Civil War, and today I will be reviewing the movie Glory from 1989. And this movie was about the 54th Regiment in the American Civil War. It starred Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, Cary Elwes, and Morgan Freeman, and it's a powerful gem from the late 1980s. At the time, it was competing with other bangers such as Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, The Little Mermaid, and Batman '89. But this movie, much like the story of the all-black regiment, was lost to history. So it's covering a little-known story in a well-known war, and it offers valuable insight into the most famous black regiment from the Civil War. The story focuses on Captain Robert Gould Shaw, who has been promoted to colonel of the 54th Infantry Regiment of the Union Army, one of the only all-black regiments. So the movie Glory takes place mainly in South Carolina. The main character is Captain Robert Gould Shaw, and the movie starts off with the Battle of Antietam, one of the main battles of the Civil War, and it was one of the bloodiest days in the Civil War history, 6,000 people dying in one day. It was a Union victory, but Captain Robert Gould Shaw got injured in the battle, and so he was forced to go home. However, based on his bravery, he earned the title of colonel, and he was commandeered the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, which was one of the first all-black regiments in the Union Army. So Shaw agrees. He appoints his friend Cabot Forbes as second in command, and they get many recruits such as John Rawlins, Jupiter Sharp's Silas Tripp, and Thomas Searles. Now, it's worth mentioning that this was one of the first all-black regiments in the Civil War, and many of the recruits were fighting for different reasons. Some were former slaves, some were free men, but they felt compelled to join the war because they felt they resonated with the message. And it's worth noting that Tripp, who was played by Denzel Washington, he did not believe that even if the Union Army won, slaves would all be freed. So there were a lot of mixed messages going on throughout this movie. So this movie deals with many powerful messages, and in a time where not many of these movies existed, which is what sets it apart in my eyes. And one of the most powerful messages was racial segregation, but inside of the army. So one of the main plot points, Shaw is assigned this group of people, and he starts training them with his commander-in-chief, Cabot Forbes. The Confederate Army issues a warning that if they find any slaves or African Americans fighting for the Union Army, if they're caught, they will be tortured and killed. And so Shaw gives all his men an opportunity to leave if they want to, but the next day he finds, to his surprise, that nobody actually leaves, and it just shows how each of them resonates with this war. Like it would take them whatever they can to continue fighting for what they believe in. Now I think it's time to introduce some characters. So Private Tripp, played by Denzel Washington, used to be a slave, so he has a bunch of scars on his back. Now I want you to remember those scars because they come in handy later. And Morgan Freeman plays John Rawlins, who used to be a grave digger, but has joined the army. And Colonel Robert Shaw, obviously played by Matthew Broderick, he's the main character. His childhood friend Thomas Searles is a free man who used to be a librarian, and he has joined the army, but he is a bit skinny, not as manly as the rest of the regiment, because he was never a slave. So it causes some tension between him and others, primarily Tripp, and he gets picked on by one of the commanding generals, and this makes him very upset. He goes to Shaw, his childhood friend, but Shaw says unfortunately he can't do anything about it, and he agrees to keep working for the cause and stay with the army. Now, another form of racial segregation comes later in the movie, when the soldiers are getting paid, they're getting their first pay cut, and normally soldiers are supposed to be paid $13 every paycheck. However, these soldiers have only received a pay of $10, and this angry Private Trip starts a revolt by tearing a slip of paper and Shaw agreeing with them. Shaw, being a white man obviously, says if you guys won't accept your pay, we won't either. So it's kind of like a revolt against the racial segregation. Now the racism doesn't end there, because one of the main problems throughout the movie was that the regiment wasn't receiving any clothes, they weren't receiving any shoes, that they needed adequate food. And Shaw confronts one of the generals about it, but the general says unfortunately they run out of shoes. And so Sergeant Tripp goes and he goes looking for shoes, but he gets caught. He gets caught going AWOL, and so Shaw orders him to be flogged. And during his flogging, his scars from his slavery are shown, and this angers Shaw because Tripp has gone through this same treatment before. So he goes back to the general. He orders them to give them the shoes, lest he expose the general. His name is Harker, and so the general eventually succeeds, gives them all shoes, and this was one of those another examples of how racism was all throughout this war. And this was one of those less known facts about this war. It wasn't just the Confederates down south who had racism. Everybody had racism at that point, even members of the Union Army. So one of the main problems in this movie is that the 54th Regiment isn't giving any chance. So the generals Harker and Montgomery aren't giving them any chance to prove themselves. They won't let them fight in any battles. And after a bunch of convincing, Shaw finally gets an approval for the 54th Regiment to fight at Morris Island. Now, the first battle at Morris Island is a huge success. The 54th Regiment, after showing their heroics, their bravery, are able to drive home the Confederate Army. And Shaw gets his 54th Regiment to be on the front lines of the battle at Fort Wagner, to be the first regiment, a frontward attack which will surely result in many, many casualties. And this brings us to the third act of the movie. On the night before the imminent death for many members, the soldiers hold a religious parade, kind of, and they celebrate with each other. They settle their differences. Tripp settles his differences with Searles, and they all go into the final battle hopeful. And before the final battle, there's this beautiful shot of Shaw looking at his soldiers, being very proud of them, and the final battle happens, and this is probably one of the most cinematic final battles of a war movie I've ever seen. I think this scene is probably up there with the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. It's just the emotional core within it, all the themes being played. It's just truly phenomenal. Now, to truly appreciate this final battle, we need to first go through all the characters. So, Shaw, throughout the movie, Shaw has been struggling with finding his place for his soldiers. I mean, as a white man commanding a black regiment, he's torn between, what should I do for my soldiers? Should I treat my soldiers harshly? How should I prepare them for battle? How do I fight this racial segregation? So that's what he's dealing with. And his commander-in-chief, Cabot Forbes, what he's dealing with is, how can he be commander? Throughout the movie, he seems unsure of himself. He seems like, oh, I'm incapable of leading a group of men. I was never capable of doing such a thing. So that's what he's dealing with. And going to the regiment itself, Rollins, played by Freeman, his main thing is he was once a gravedigger, and now he finds himself on the battlefield. And it's worth noting that after the assault on Morris Island, he was promoted. He was promoted to sergeant, so he's basically an acting commander. And what he's struggling with is how do I lead these men when they're so different? Some of them are slaves. How do I inspire something in all of them? And then we have Trip, the man who was flogged, played by Denzel Washington. What he's struggling with is he was once a slave, and before the final battle, Trip is asked by Shaw if he would hold the colors for the battle, if he would hold the flag, and he rejects this offer. And he explains that he doesn't feel like this war really represents him, and he was once a slave, and he doesn't believe that even after this war ends, slavery will be abolished, and that is something that he needs to be sure of in order to really be represented in this war. Searles was a childhood friend of Shaw. He was never a slave. He's not as manly as these people. He's very skinny. He was mistreated throughout this war within the regiment from the commanders. And basically all he's trying to do is just make something worth with himself. And now, following the battle at Morris Island, he was injured. He was injured trying to save Trip's life. And he was offered to go home, but he said no. He said he would stay with these men, fight with them. Even after many disagreements with Trip, he decided to stay. So the final battle happens. We have Shaw, who, in an attempt to rally his men, sacrifices himself. He gets shot with bullets. And then Trip tries to hold the colors, even after he said he wouldn't. He gets shot as well, so Rawlins and Forbes are forced to lead the men by themselves. And many members of the regiment are killed. They're pinned against the fort, but they manage to overrun the fort. And just on the brink of victory, cannons are shot at them, and they all do unfortunately die. So this was a Confederate victory, the battle at Fort Wagner. Despite their frontal attack, no regiments were able to take down the fort. And at the end of the day, in the morning, it was a Confederate flag that still reigned over the fort. And the Confederates buried Shaw's dead body with his men in an attempt to insult him, to say, oh, he's leading these black men against us. He doesn't deserve a proper burial. So Robert Gould Shaw's father, following the battle, said, we would not have his body removed from where it lies, surrounded by his brave and devoted soldiers, if we could accomplish it by a word. So his father supported this burial, and he's basically saying, Shaw has been with these men for this long. He deserves to be buried with them in peace. And that is unfortunately how the movie ends, kind of on a sad note. It is a loss. Almost everyone did die. The fate of Rawlins and Forbes and Jupiter are unknown, but it is confirmed that Searles, Trip, and Shaw did die, and I would assume that they all died. Over half the regiment did lose their lives on that day. And though it was technically a loss, this inspired many other regiments. Abraham Lincoln would later credit this group of extraordinary men in the Union eventual victory of the Civil War. And this movie, the reason it resonates with me is because it has a lot of classic tropes, classic themes, racism, segregation, war. These are all common in movies, especially in the late 1900s. But it really tells a story that was not very well known. Like, almost all Americans know the story of the American Civil War, but not many do know there was a black regiment in the Civil War. These stories are still very symbolic of just what it was like in the Civil War for some people, right? And I think my favorite character would definitely have to be Trip. He used to be a slave. He doesn't feel like this war represents him, but he still eventually donned the colors, and he was buried with Shaw. They were buried next to each other. And though Shaw is the main character, I think Trip, in a way, is also the main character of this story, and it really just shows how powerful this movie is. If I were to rate it, I would say solid 9 out of 10. One of the better war movies I've seen, definitely. I think I would put it up there with other gems like T-34 maybe. I don't think it's on Schindler's List or Saving Private Ryan level, um, but it still is a very powerful movie and still very watchable to this day. It was made many decades ago, but overall a very good movie. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something about the Civil War from this video, and yeah, I'll see you guys next time.